The phone rang at 3:14 p.m., a sharp shrill that tore through the silence of the nursery. Emily Carter was on her knees, her 8-month pregnant belly resting on her thighs as she folded a tiny onesie, a yellow so soft it looked like captured sunlight. She smiled, picturing her son's little face inside it. Then the phone rang again. She pushed herself up with a grunt, her hand flat against the small of her back, and answered on speaker without checking the number. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was one she didn't know. It was a man, his tone deep and official, and it made the hair on her arms stand up. "Ma'am, is this Emily Carter?" "Yes, this is she. This is Trooper Hayes from the New York State Police. Your husband, Brian Smith, has been in a car accident on I-87 North, heading toward Albany." The air froze in her lungs. The yellow onesie slipped from her hands and fell to the floor. An accident? Is he okay? The pause on the other end of the line stretched for an eternity. "He's alive, ma'am. He's been transported to Mount Sinai Hospital, but he wasn't alone." The last sentence hung in the air, heavy with a weight she couldn't immediately decipher. He wasn't alone. Of course not. He was probably with a client, maybe closing a big deal. Brian was a sales director at a luxury car dealership. He lived for his job. "Who was he with?" she asked, her voice barely a thread. "We don't have that information in the report, ma'am, only that the female passenger was also admitted. You need to come to the hospital right away." The trooper hung up. Emily stood there, phone in hand, her gaze fixed on the fallen onesie. He wasn't alone. The phrase echoed, taking on a new, darker, sharper shape. A tremor started in her hands and spread down her legs. She leaned against the dresser, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. It wasn't a client, she felt it. It was something else. Without thinking, she grabbed her purse, her car keys, and left the apartment, pulling the door shut without locking it. In the elevator, the mirror reflected a woman she barely recognized. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and haunted, her enormous pregnant belly seeming like a fragile shield against whatever awaited her. The tears came without warning, silent and hot as she drove through the rainy, upscale streets of the Upper East Side. Every red light was torture, every slow car in front of her an unbearable obstacle. The trooper's words wouldn't leave her, hammering along with the pulse in her temples. He wasn't alone. Mount Sinai Hospital was a chaos of beeping machines, white coats, and hurried voices. The smell of antiseptic invaded her nostrils, making her instantly nauseous. She approached the reception desk, her heart pounding against her ribs. "My husband, Brian Smith. He was in an accident." The receptionist, a woman with a tired gaze, typed the name into the computer. "He's in the ER, Wing B. Speak to the head nurse at the desk at the end of the hall." Emily thanked her with a nod and walked, feeling the sympathetic stares of people in the hallway. The pregnant wife, the desperate wife. Each step was heavy, the corridor seemed endless. At the desk in Wing B, an older nurse with a severe expression was waiting. "Emily Carter?" "Yes, your husband is stable. He has a fracture in his left arm and some contusions, but he's conscious. The doctor will speak with you shortly." A wave of relief so intense washed over her that her legs buckled. Alive, conscious. She grabbed the counter to keep from falling. And the other person? The one who was with him? The nurse looked at her for a second, a flicker of what looked like compassion in her eyes. "His companion is in the bay next to him. Minor injuries." The word companion sounded strange, too intimate. The nurse handed her a clipboard with an intake form. "I need you to sign here, please." Emily took the pen, but her eyes drifted to the top of the page. There was her husband's name, written in the hurried script of a paramedic. Patient, Brian Smith, Bay 14. Accompanying passenger, Olivia Chen. The name hit her like a punch to the gut. The air was stolen from her lungs. It couldn't be. Olivia Chen, the neighbor from 12D, the yoga instructor with the sweet smile and the quiet husband. The woman who, just 3 days ago, had knocked on her door to give her a jar of homemade jam and ask with sparkling eyes if she was feeling the baby kick a lot yet. The same Olivia who had taken her hand and said, "You're going to be an amazing mom, Emily. I have so much admiration for you." The blood drained from her face. The clipboard slipped from her fingers and hit the floor with a sharp crack. The sound of heart monitors, a doctor being paged over the intercom, the cry of a child somewhere down the hall, it all merged into a high-pitched, distant buzz. She put a hand on her belly, an instinctive gesture of protection, and her knees gave way. She fell right there, in the middle of the hospital corridor, her world reduced to that name written on a form: Olivia, the neighbor, the friend, the lover. The floor was cold and hard beneath her knees. For a moment, the world shrank to that sensation. The cold seeping through her jeans, the pressure on her bones, the dull ache that was a distant echo of the real pain settling in her chest. The nurse rushed over, her concerned voice cutting through the ringing in Emily's ears. "Ma'am? Ma'am, are you all right?" Someone helped her up. Firm hands under her arms guided her to an uncomfortable plastic chair against the wall. She sat, but her body didn't feel like her own. It was a heavy, hollow shell, with a dead weight in her belly that for the first time wasn't her son, but the weight of betrayal. Olivia Chen. The name was a poison spreading through her veins. Every memory, every interaction with her neighbor was now reconfigured under a sick, cruel light. The unexpected visits with the excuse of borrowing a cup of sugar. The chats in the elevator where Olivia always found a way to ask about Brian, about his work, his trips. "He must work so hard, poor thing. You have to take good care of him, Emily." The phrase, which once sounded like female solidarity, was now a mocking, disguised stab. The sharpest, most painful memory came next. A Sunday, 2 months ago, at the rooftop barbecue, a building get-together. Emily was sitting, tired from the advancing pregnancy, while Brian was at the grill with the other men. Olivia came over, sat beside her, and placed a hand on her belly. "Can I feel?" she'd asked with a sweetness that now made Emily sick. And then, her eyes locked on Emily's, she said, "It's such a magical connection, isn't it? Between a mother and child. Nothing can break that." There, sitting in the sterile hospital hallway, Emily understood the depth of that lie. It wasn't just an affair, a slip-up. It was a performance, a cruel play staged right under her nose, in the place she called home. The neighbor didn't want to be her friend. She wanted a front-row seat to observe her life, perhaps to compare, perhaps for pure sadism. Every question about the pregnancy, every piece of advice about vitamins and morning sickness, wasn't empathy. It was information gathering. It was a way to test the waters, to know just how oblivious the pregnant wife was to the world of lies her husband was building. A young doctor with thin-rimmed glasses and a serious expression stopped in front of her. "Mrs. Carter? I'm Dr. Miller, the doctor on call. Your husband is out of danger. The distal radius fracture in his left arm will need to be immobilized, but there's no neurological damage. He was lucky." The word lucky sounded like an insult. Lucky to be alive to face the destruction he had caused. "Can I see him?" Emily asked, her voice unrecognizable. The doctor hesitated. "He's sedated for the pain right now, and the other patient is in the same observation bay. Maybe it's better to wait a little." "No," Emily said, with a firmness that surprised herself. "I want to see him now." The doctor observed her, his professional gaze trying to decipher what lay behind that cold determination. He saw the prominent belly, the pale face, the eyes that no longer shed tears but held a storm. He nodded. "All right, this way." The observation bay was separated from the hallway by only a green curtain. The doctor pulled it aside, and the scene was revealed. 2 beds, side by side. On the right, Brian, his left arm wrapped in a white splint, his face scratched, his eyes closed under the effect of the sedatives. Even unconscious, his expression looked guilty. On the bed to the left, less than 6 feet away from him, was Olivia. She had a bandage on her forehead, near her hairline, and was staring at the ceiling with glassy eyes. She didn't see Emily enter. She was lost in her own world of pain and consequences. Emily froze in the entryway, a statue of ice. The air grew dense, heavy, hard to breathe. There they were, together, living proof, side by side, of the lie that defined her life. The man she shared a bed with, dreams, a future child, and the woman who offered her homemade jam and maternal advice. The intimacy of that scene was more devastating than any confession. They weren't just lovers. They shared an accident, a hospital bay, a destiny. They were a unit. And she was the outsider, the piece that didn't fit in this equation of betrayal. It was then that Olivia slowly turned her head, and her eyes met Emily's. The recognition was instant, followed by a wave of panic that contorted her features. Olivia's lips parted, but no sound came out. She was a fish out of water, gasping for the air that the truth had stolen from her. The fear on her face was ugly, stripped of any dignity. There was no remorse there, only the terror of being caught. In that gaze, Emily didn't see the smiling neighbor, the yoga instructor, the friend. She saw a cornered predator. Emily didn't look away. She held the gaze, feeling a cold, cutting strength take hold of her. There was no room for tears, or for screams, or for the despair that had consumed her minutes before. There was only a brutal clarity. She took a step into the room, then another. Each movement was deliberate, heavy. She stopped beside Brian's bed without looking at him. Her eyes remained fixed on Olivia. "He wasn't alone," Emily said, her voice low but echoing in the silence of the room. She repeated the trooper's words, returning them to their source. The phrase hit Olivia with the force of a slap. The woman flinched, her gaze darting to the white sheet as if she could hide there. "Emily, she began, her voice a broken whisper. "No," Emily cut her off, her tone glacial. "Don't you dare say my name." The silence that followed was broken only by the rhythmic beep of Brian's heart monitor, a steady, mechanical sound marking the time of this new, terrible reality. Emily turned and looked at her husband for the first time. The man she loved, or thought she loved, the father of her child. His face, even in repose, looked like a stranger's. The features she knew so well, that she kissed every morning, were now tainted by the lie. She reached out her hand but stopped inches from his face. The right to touch was gone. What they had built, had been shattered on I-87, inside a luxury car with the neighbor in the passenger seat. She moved away from the bed, her body rigid. The adrenaline that had kept her standing was beginning to fade, giving way to a profound exhaustion that rose from the soles of her feet. Her belly felt heavy, and a sharp pain in her lower back made her hold her breath. The baby moved, a strong kick, as if protesting the anguish surrounding him. She placed her hand over her abdomen, a protective gesture, and in that instant of alliance, she knew it was the two of them now, just them. She turned to leave but paused at the doorway. There was one more thing to do, one final piece to move on this board of pain. She took her phone from her purse, her hands shaking slightly. She found the contact she had only used once to RSVP for that building barbecue. Daniel Chen, Olivia's husband. The quiet, soft-spoken civil engineer who always seemed to be in the shadow of his sociable, smiling wife. An honest, hard-working man who, just like her, was about to have his world turned upside down. She felt a pang of hesitation. She was about to detonate another human being's life, but the image of Olivia and Brian, side by side in those beds, erased any trace of doubt. The truth, however brutal, needed to be complete. Their lie had created two victims, and the victims deserved to know. She took a deep breath, stepped out of the room, and walked back down the hall, finding a more isolated corner near a window overlooking an inner courtyard. Night was already falling over New York City, cold and indifferent. She dialed the number. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Each tone was another beat in the countdown to detonation. Emily rested her forehead against the cool glass of the window, watching the darkness swallow the hospital courtyard. She wondered what Daniel was doing at that very moment, maybe watching the news, maybe making a solitary dinner, waiting for his wife to get back from her extra yoga class, or meeting up with friends. The banality of the lie was what made it so sordid. She wasn't just destroying a marriage, she was ripping apart the fabric of normalcy for a man who, until that moment, probably believed he lived an ordinary, secure life. "Finally," he answered. The voice on the other end was exactly as she remembered it. Low, a little tired, uninflected. "Hello?" Emily swallowed, the metallic taste of adrenaline in her mouth. She needed to be direct, clinical. Any trace of emotion in her voice could be misinterpreted as hysteria or confusion. "Daniel? It's Emily from 18B. There was a brief pause, just enough time for him to process who was calling him at this hour. The pregnant neighbor from downstairs. "Emily? Is everything okay?" The concern in his voice was genuine, likely imagining a problem with her pregnancy, an emergency. The irony was almost unbearable. "You need to come to Mount Sinai Hospital." "Now," she said, the words coming out firm, almost mechanical. "It's about Olivia." The silence that followed was unlike any silence Emily had ever heard. It wasn't a pause to think, it was a dense, heavy vacuum where all terrible possibilities bloomed at once. She could almost hear him on the other end, putting the pieces together. The call from the neighbor, the name of the hospital, the urgency, the fact it wasn't his wife giving him the news. In seconds, the house of cards of his trust was beginning to crumble. She didn't need to say anything else. The omission was the message. When he finally spoke, his voice was unrecognizable. The low, tired tone was gone, replaced by something clipped and hard as stone. "I'm on my way." The call ended. No questions, no requests for details. The absence of questions was the most terrifying confirmation of all. Perhaps, deep down, he already knew. Perhaps the seed of doubt was already planted, just waiting for the torrential rain of the truth to germinate. Men like Daniel, quiet and observant, often see more than they let on. He didn't ask what had happened because the question that really mattered was, with whom? And the answer he perhaps already suspected wouldn't come from a work accident or a mugging. It would come from something much more intimate and rotten. Emily put her phone away and returned to the plastic chair, her body now weighing a ton. The call had drained the last of her strength. She felt like both an accomplice and a victim, the messenger of the apocalypse and one of its survivors. Time began to drag. Each minute was a small eternity. She watched the movement in the hallway, nurses rushing, families crying, doctors with impenetrable expressions, a microcosm of pain and relief. And she was there, at the epicenter of her own private drama, waiting for the next act to begin. She thought of her son. Her hand returned instinctively to her belly, a safe harbor in the shipwreck. He kicked again, softer this time, as if sensing her exhaustion. In that moment, a decision formed in her mind, clear and unbreakable. This child would not grow up in a home built on the rubble of a lie. He would not have a father whose integrity was a sham, a mother who shrank herself to fit into a broken marriage. That kick wasn't just a fetal movement. It was a reminder that a life depended on her strength, on her courage. The pain of the betrayal was immense, but the love for this being she had yet to meet was greater. And it would be that love that guided her out of here. 25 minutes later, she saw him. Daniel Chen appeared at the end of the hallway, walking with a contained urgency. He didn't look frantic, but there was a stiffness in his shoulders and an intensity to his stride that betrayed the storm inside. His eyes scanned the area and found her. He approached, his face an impenetrable mask. Up close, she could see it. His normally calm eyes were dark, and a small vein throbbed at his temple. He didn't need explanations. His gaze already said that something fundamental inside him had been shattered. "Where is she?" he asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. Emily just stood up and nodded toward the green curtain. No words were necessary. They were now unlikely allies, bound by the same betrayal, walking together toward the epicenter of the disaster. She felt a strange, grim camaraderie with this man she barely knew. They had both been deceived by the two people who should have protected their hearts. She followed him, stopping a step behind as he pulled back the curtain. The scene was the same. Brian, still sedated, a monument to his own weakness. And Olivia, who was now sitting up on the bed, her legs dangling over the side as if she were about to get up. She looked toward the entrance, expecting to see Emily again, but her face crumbled when she saw Daniel standing there, his expression a death sentence. The air in the room grew thin. The beep of Brian's monitor seemed to mock the scene, an indifferent metronome for the end of two marriages. Olivia brought a hand to her mouth, a dry sob escaping her lips. The panic in her eyes was total. She looked from Daniel to Emily, standing just behind him, and the realization of the alliance between the two betrayed spouses hit her with its full force. There was nowhere to run. Daniel took a step forward, his body tense as a steel cable. He looked at his wife, then at the sleeping man in the next bed, and the connection between the two facts solidified before his eyes. The disbelief on his face was painful to watch. "Olivia, what is this?" he asked, his voice breaking for the first time. It wasn't a question about the accident, it was about everything. About the two of them, here, together, in a hospital room. About the nights she came home late, the mysterious calls, the subtle distance that had grown between them. Olivia started to cry, a desperate, ugly cry of someone caught with no more excuses. "It was a mistake, Daniel. A mistake," she stammered between sobs, the cliché words sounding hollow and pathetic. "It's not what you think." But it was exactly what he thought. Her denial was an insult to his intelligence. Daniel didn't answer. He just kept looking at her, his silence more damning than any shout. His eyes then shifted, landing on Emily. There was a silent question in his gaze, a search for confirmation. Emily just held his look, an almost imperceptible nod. "Yes, it's exactly this. The two of them." Emily remained motionless by the door, a silent observer of the ruin she had set in motion. She felt no pleasure, no revenge, only a cold emptiness. Seeing Daniel's pain was like looking at her own reflection in a shattered mirror. She saw the same humiliation, the same disbelief, the same feeling of having been played for a fool. The woman who asked for pregnancy advice, who feigned admiration, was now crying over being caught with another woman's husband. And then, a subtle detail she hadn't noticed before jumped out at her. The way Olivia was sitting, the way her hands rested instinctively over her own abdomen. A terrible, unlikely suspicion began to form in Emily's mind, a suspicion that turned the entire situation into something even more grotesque and complex. Emily's gaze sharpened, locking onto Olivia's almost unconscious gesture. Her hand, which moments before had been flailing in desperation, now rested protectively on her lower abdomen. It was a movement Emily knew intimately, a reflex that had become part of her over the past months. Emily's already overloaded brain began connecting dots that had previously seemed random. Olivia's incessant questions about the first trimester, her curiosity about prenatal vitamins, the conversation about baby names Olivia had initiated in the elevator, disguising it as casual interest in Emily's choices. At the time, it had seemed like just a woman fascinated by another's pregnancy. Now, under the cruel fluorescent light of the hospital, it took on a new, monstrous meaning. The woman asking for pregnancy advice was pregnant. The revelation didn't come like a lightning strike, but like a slow, paralyzing seepage of ice water. The air felt even thinner. Olivia's crying, Daniel's broken words, the constant beep of the monitor, it all became background noise to the deafening buzz of this new truth in her mind. She looked at Olivia's belly, hidden under the loose-fitting hospital gown. There was no obvious bump like her own, but there was a certain fullness, a posture she recognized. It was the beginning. The secret Olivia was keeping wasn't just an affair, it was a consequence. Daniel, lost in his own grief, didn't notice the focus of Emily's stare. He took another step toward his wife, anger beginning to overcome the shock. "A mistake?" he repeated, his voice low and dangerous. "A mistake is taking the wrong exit on the highway, Olivia. A mistake is forgetting to pay a bill. Being in a car, out of town, with the neighbor's husband, that is not a mistake. That's a choice you've made every single day." Every word was a blow. Olivia shrank back, her face streaked with tears. "It wasn't like that. I was going to tell you," she lied, her voice weak, grasping for any lifeline in the shipwreck. "Tell me what?" Daniel pressed, his voice rising. "That you were cheating on me? Or were you going to wait for him to leave his pregnant wife to break the news?" The mention of Emily's pregnancy hung in the air. Daniel glanced at Emily for a second, and for the first time, the full dimension of the situation's cruelty seemed to hit him. It wasn't just a betrayal between two couples, it was a betrayal against a woman at her most vulnerable. His expression hardened even further, contempt replacing the anger. It was at that moment that Brian began to stir in the next bed. The sedative was wearing off. He moaned, a low, guttural sound, and his eyes fluttered open, blinking against the light. His first sight was the white ceiling. His second, as he turned his head, was his world falling apart. He saw Olivia crying. He saw Daniel standing there, tense as an animal about to pounce. And finally, he saw Emily, motionless by the door, her face a blank canvas onto which he could project all his guilt. "Emily," he whispered, the name coming out with difficulty. Emily didn't respond. She just watched him, her gaze empty, devoid of any emotion he could recognize. Where he expected to see fury or tears, he found only nothingness, and that nothingness was infinitely more terrifying. Brian's presence, now conscious, changed the dynamic in the room. Daniel turned toward him, a new target for his rage. "You," he said, his voice laced with disgust, "you came into my home. You shook my hand, ate at my table, and behind my back, you were with my wife." Brian tried to sit up, but the pain in his arm made him grimace and fall back. "Daniel, calm down. Let's talk," he began, using the placating sales director tone that had saved him so many times. But here, in this context, it sounded pathetic. "Talk?" Daniel laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "There's nothing to talk about. This scene here speaks for itself." He turned back to Olivia, his focus returning to the source of his pain. "It's over, Olivia. Get your things. I don't want to see you again." It was then that Olivia's desperation peaked. The threat of losing everything, her husband, her home, her stability, made her play her last, most terrible card. "You can't do this," she shrieked, her voice shrill. "Daniel, I'm pregnant." The silence that fell over the room was absolute, so profound the monitor's beep seemed to scream. Daniel froze, his head turning slowly toward her, his expression one of total disbelief. Brian, in the other bed, stared wide-eyed, shock stamped on his face. He hadn't known either. That was a part of the secret Olivia had kept for herself. Emily closed her eyes for an instant. So, it was true. The suspicion was confirmed in the most brutal way possible. She felt the floor disappear from under her, but her body didn't move. The adrenaline returned in full force, a cold surge of energy that kept her standing, watching the final act of this tragedy. Daniel looked at Olivia's belly, then back at her face. His mind was working furiously, trying to process the information, trying to fit it into the timeline of betrayal. "Pregnant?" he repeated, the word alien in his mouth. A flicker of what might have been joy in other circumstances shone in his eyes but was immediately extinguished by a venomous doubt. He looked at Brian, then back at Olivia. The question didn't need to be asked. It was written on every tense muscle of his face. "It's yours, Daniel. Of course it's yours," Olivia said hurriedly, her voice skating on the edge of her desperation to convince him. "We were trying, remember? It's yours, I swear." But the oath sounded false. The seed of distrust, once planted, was a weed impossible to pull. The fact that she had hidden the pregnancy until this moment of desperation was proof that something was wrong. She hadn't shared the news with joy. She was using it as a shield, a weapon of emotional blackmail. Brian, for his part, was pale. He looked at Olivia, then at her belly, then at Emily. His expression was a mix of shock, confusion, and abject fear. His consequence-free affair had just acquired a complication he never imagined. A child, perhaps his child, growing in another man's wife's womb, while his own wife carried his legitimate heir. The sick symmetry of it. Emily watched the scene, feeling strangely detached, as if watching a movie. She saw the pieces move, the bonds break, the lies layering upon lies. She saw the trap Olivia had built for herself. In trying to hold on to her husband with the news of a baby, she had only lit the fuse on a much larger bomb, the paternity. Daniel said nothing more. He looked one last time at the woman crying on the bed, then at the man who was the cause of his ruin. There was defeat in his eyes, the bitter acceptance that nothing could be saved. He turned, his body moving with the stiffness of a much older man, and walked toward the door. He passed Emily without looking at her, but for a second his shoulders slumped, and she felt the weight of the pain shared between them. Then he was gone, leaving behind the silence and the wreckage of two lives. In the room, The three of them remained, the love triangle now exposed in all its sordidness. Olivia sobbed quietly. Brian stared into the void, his broken arm the least of his pains, and Emily finally moved. She walked slowly to Brian's bed. He looked up at her, a plea evident in his face. "Emily, forgive me. Please, I can explain." She looked at him not with hatred, but with a kind of clinical curiosity, like a scientist observing a specimen. "Explain what, Brian?" she asked, her voice calm and level. "That you cheated on me? Or that you cheated on me with the neighbor who pretended to be my friend? Or maybe you want to explain how you had the nerve to do this while I'm carrying your son? And now there's this." Her gaze shifted to Olivia, who flinched under the weight of her attention. "You destroyed our family," Emily continued, her voice still low, but every word cutting through the air. "You destroyed everything we built. And for what? For someone who is pregnant and doesn't even seem sure who the father is?" She didn't wait for an answer. There was no answer that could fix this. She turned and walked out of the room, leaving the two lovers behind, alone with the ruins of their choices. In the hallway, she didn't stop. She kept walking, past the reception desk, through the automatic glass doors, until the cold New York night air hit her face. She took a deep breath. The freezing air burned her lungs, but it cleared her mind. There were no more tears. There was only a resolution, cold and hard as steel. That was the last time she would allow herself to be a victim in this story. From this moment on, she would be the architect of her own future, and of her own justice. The hospital's glass doors slid shut behind Emily, muffling the chaos of beeps and voices and leaving her in the cold silence of the night. She didn't go straight to her car. Instead, she walked to an empty concrete bench under the yellow glow of a street lamp and sat. The cold of the stone seeped through her jeans, but she barely felt it. Her body was numb, a protective shell around the whirlwind of thoughts and the sharp pain that refused to become tears. She wouldn't cry. Not here. Crying was a release, and she felt that if she started, she wouldn't be able to stop. She needed her strength intact. She sat there for an unmeasured amount of time, watching cars stream down the avenue, each one containing a universe of stories unknown to her. People going home to their families, to their normal lives. The word normal now seemed to belong to a foreign language. Her life had been split into a before and an after, and the border was a hospital room with 2 beds and 1 exposed lie. The phrase she had said to Brian echoed in her mind, "You destroyed our family." But as she'd said it, she realized a deeper truth. A family built on such fragile foundations, so susceptible to the first storm, was perhaps already broken long before the final collapse. The betrayal wasn't the earthquake, it was just the tremor that revealed the cracks she, in her trusting happiness, had refused to see. Memories from the past few months began to align in a new way, like puzzle pieces rearranged to form a grotesque picture. Brian's weekend business trips he justified as essential to hitting targets. The times he came home late, smelling of a perfume that wasn't hers, claiming it was from a client on a test drive. The subtle distance, the phone now always face down on the nightstand, the irritability when she asked about his day. Each of those small signs she had dismissed as work stress or sensitive pregnancy paranoia now revealed themselves as red flags she had ignored. She hadn't just been deceived, she, in her blind trust, had allowed the deception to flourish. The hospital door opened again, and a nurse she recognized from the hallway approached cautiously. "Mrs. Carter? Are you okay? You shouldn't be out here in the cold." Emily looked up. "I'm leaving in a moment. I just needed a minute." The nurse hesitated, professional compassion warring with the desire not to intrude. "Your husband is asking for you. He's quite upset." Emily felt a wave of revulsion. Upset. He was upset, as if his well-being was somehow a priority now. "Tell him I've gone home," she replied, her voice firm. "And the other patient," the nurse continued, lowering her voice. "Her husband came back. They're speaking with the social worker now." The news struck her with a morbid curiosity. Daniel had returned. The man who had walked out of there broken, without looking back, had come back to the epicenter of the pain. Perhaps out of responsibility, perhaps for a formal closure. Or perhaps because of that terrible word Olivia had thrown into the air, pregnant. A child, even one of questionable origin, created a bond that couldn't be broken by simply turning your back. Driven by an impulse she didn't fully understand, Emily stood up. She wasn't going home, not yet. There was one final chapter to witness tonight. She walked back into the hospital, but not to the ER wing. She followed the direction the nurse had indicated with her gaze, toward a small waiting area near the social services office. From a safe distance, hidden by the impersonal architecture of the hallway, she could see the scene through a glass window. Daniel sat in a chair, his body hunched forward, elbows on his knees, head in his hands. Olivia sat in another chair across from him, and between them, a tired-looking woman, the social worker, was trying to mediate the impossible. Olivia's voice was a pleading murmur, inaudible through the glass. She gesticulated, she cried, she pointed at her own belly. It was there, in that sterile room under the cold light, that the final layers of the truth were stripped away. Later, a doctor who was a family friend, whom Emily contacted in a moment of lucid desperation, would tell her the details of what was said in that room. Olivia's confession, extracted under the pressure of imminent loss, was a pathetic mix of half-truths and manipulation. She admitted the affair with Brian wasn't new. They had a brief relationship years before, shortly after they moved into the building, something they both agreed to end. But the flame, she claimed, had been rekindled a few months ago. And the cruelest detail, the final stab into Daniel's trust, was the timeline. She confessed that the reunion with Brian happened after she found out she was pregnant. The child, she swore up and down, was Daniel's. Conception had occurred during a period when they were actively trying, a last-ditch effort to save a marriage that was already quietly crumbling. But upon discovering she was pregnant, instead of turning toward her husband, she panicked. She felt suffocated and sought out Brian as an escape valve, a dose of adrenaline and attention she felt she was missing at home. She didn't love him, she told Daniel. It was a weakness, a stupid mistake, a search to feel desired at a moment of insecurity. She kept seeing him, even while carrying another man's child, because it was easier to live the thrill of the lie than to face the reality of her dying marriage. 2 marriages, 2 homes, 2 lies, intertwined by the thoughtlessness of 2 people who thought only of themselves. Brian, seeking excitement outside of a marriage with a pregnant wife. Olivia, using her lover as a bandage for her own relationship's wounds while carrying a child who deserved better. They weren't tragic lovers. They were just selfish people who, to satisfy a momentary desire, didn't hesitate to risk the fabric of 4 lives and 2 unborn children. Emily, watching from afar, felt the last remnant of feeling for Brian turn to ash. It was no longer pain or anger. It was a deep, bitter contempt. He hadn't betrayed her for a great love, for an overwhelming passion that might redeem him in some romantic tragedy. He had betrayed her for boredom, for vanity, for the cheap thrill of an affair with the married neighbor. He had traded the family they were building, the sanctity of their child's birth, for a sordid, reheated fling with a woman who was using him as a hobby. She saw Daniel stand up. He didn't say a word. He just looked at Olivia, a long, empty gaze that seemed to pass right through her. It was the look of a man surveying the rubble of his own home, knowing not a single beam could be saved. Then he turned and walked out of the room, through the hospital's main doors, and disappeared into the night. This time, for good. He didn't look back. Emily turned and left, too. There was nothing more to see there. The destruction was complete. She drove home on autopilot, her mind strangely quiet. The apartment, once a sanctuary, now felt like a crime scene. Every object, every photo on the wall, every piece of furniture they had chosen together was a witness to the lie. She went into the nursery. The yellow onesie was still on the floor. She picked it up. The softness of the fabric in her hands was the only real thing in a world that had become a nightmare. She wouldn't dismantle this room. She would finish it. Alone. The next morning, the first call she made was to a lawyer. The second was to a real estate agency. The third was to a moving company. She acted with cold, methodical efficiency, as if managing an architectural project, not the demolition of her own life. Every decision was a step away from him, away from that building, away from the woman in 12D. Brian was discharged late that afternoon. He called Emily dozens of times, but she didn't answer. He then took a cab home, likely expecting to find her, ready to deploy his charm, his apologies, his empty promises. But when he opened the door to apartment 18B, he found it nearly empty. Boxes were stacked in the corners, blank spaces on the walls where pictures used to hang, the echo of a life that no longer existed. On the glass coffee table, the only piece of furniture left in the living room was a manila envelope. His name, Brian, was written in Emily's elegant script. With trembling hands, his good arm struggling against the sling, immobilizing the other, he opened it. Inside, there was no letter of hate or pain. There were only 3 things. The first was a copy of the accident report Emily's lawyer had already obtained, where the cause excessive speed on wet pavement was highlighted. The second was a copy of their son's latest ultrasound, the black and white image of a perfect profile, a life beating, oblivious to its father's sordidness. And the third was a small note with a single sentence. While you were lying, I was learning to live. There was no signature. None was needed. Brian stood in the middle of the empty room, staring at those 3 pieces of paper, the proof of his recklessness, the image of his loss, and her declaration of independence. He didn't have the courage to touch the ultrasound. He just sank to the floor, in the middle of the emptiness, and the weight of everything he had lost finally crushed him. The divorce was a swift, brutally efficient process. Emily instructed her lawyer not to negotiate, only to execute. She wanted nothing more than what was rightfully hers and her freedom. As the paperwork moved forward, she settled into a rented apartment in a quiet part of the city, a neighborhood with tree-lined streets and the feeling of a new beginning. The space was smaller, simpler, but every square inch was hers. There were no memories of Brian embedded in the walls, no risk of running into Olivia in the elevator. It was neutral territory, a blank canvas. With a calmness that surprised her, she began to assemble the nursery. She painted the walls a soft gray. She put the crib together with her own 2 hands, following the instruction manual with an almost meditative focus. Every tightened screw, every fitted piece, was an act of construction, an affirmation of her ability to create and sustain a life on her own. She didn't feel Brian's absence. In fact, the solitude was productive, quiet, allowing her to connect with a strength she didn't know she possessed. The room was ready in a week, a nest of peace and promise, built not on the remains of a family, but on the solid foundation of a woman rediscovering herself. News of the others arrived in fragments, through mutual acquaintances and the inevitable gossip mill of the old building. Olivia was discharged 2 days after Brian. Daniel, true to his word, was not there to pick her up. He filed for divorce and, in an act of cold mercy, demanded a prenatal DNA test. The result, which came weeks later, was the final nail in that marriage's coffin. The child was indeed his. But the biological confirmation changed nothing. The breach of trust had been too profound. Daniel agreed to meet all his obligations as a father, but made it clear that the marriage was dead and buried. Olivia, now a pariah in the building and abandoned by her lover, would face motherhood in a solitude of her own making. Brian, for his part, spiraled. The empty apartment became his prison. The absence of Emily and the life they had was a ghost that haunted him in every silent room. He tried to call, to text, to beg for a second chance, but Emily had blocked his number. The only communication he received was through lawyers. He lost focus at work. The shine of the star salesman faded, and the luxury car director became a shadow of his former self, now selling only the image of a man who had lost everything. 3 weeks after the accident, on a sunny Saturday morning, the doorbell of Emily's new apartment rang. Her heart leaped, a remnant of the old fear that it might be Brian. But when she looked through the peephole, she saw an unexpected figure. It was Daniel Chen. She hesitated for a moment, then opened the door. He looked thinner, older, but there was a new, hard resolution in his eyes. He didn't smile. "I'm sorry to show up like this," he said, his voice low. "I just needed to give you this." He held out an envelope. It wasn't a letter envelope, but a larger one for documents. "What is it?" she asked. "It's a copy of the DNA test." And a proposal from me and my lawyers. Confused, Emily invited him in. They sat in the small living room, an awkward silence between them. She opened the envelope. She saw the report confirming Daniel's paternity, and under it, a legal document. It was a settlement proposal. Daniel was offering her the entirety of the compensation Brian's dealership would have to pay for moral damages, a substantial sum his lawyer was confident of getting. In exchange, he asked for something that made Emily's breath catch in her throat. He was asking for shared custody, not of his child, but of hers. "I don't understand," Emily said, the paper trembling in her hand. "It's simple," Daniel began, looking not at her, but out the window. "My son is going to be born into a home broken by your ex-husband. Your son is going to be born without a father present for the same reason. I can't fix what happened to my family, but maybe I can help fix what happened to yours." He finally looked at her, and for the first time, she saw not just pain, but a fierce determination. "I don't want to be a substitute. I know I'm not his father, but I can be a father figure. I can teach your son how to throw a ball, how to be an honest man. I can be there for birthdays, for graduations. I can give him a brother. Our sons, Emily, are not to blame for any of this. They are the only innocent victims, and they'll be linked forever by their parents' story. Maybe they can grow up together, like a family, a different, strange, patched-together family, but a family." Emily sat in silence, her world spinning. The proposal was insane, unprecedented, and yet it made a terrible, profound kind of sense. It was a form of poetic justice she could never have conceived. To take the destruction caused by two people and, from it, build something new and functional for the two children who were the innocent legacy of that betrayal. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "Don't say anything now," he replied, standing up. "Think about it. Talk to your lawyer. The offer is serious. I'm not doing this out of pity for you. I'm doing it for them." He left, leaving Emily alone with the document and the possibility of a future she had never imagined. A week later, her son was born, a healthy baby with curious eyes and strong lungs. The day she was discharged, she found 2 bouquets of flowers in her apartment. One was anonymous, with a simple card that read, "Congratulations on our son. Forgive me." She threw it in the trash without reading the rest. The other was a simple arrangement of wildflowers with a handwritten card. "Welcome to the world, champ. Your brother is looking forward to meeting you. Respectfully, Daniel." In that moment, holding her son in her arms, Emily knew the answer. She hadn't been reborn alone. She had been reborn alongside an unlikely ally in the construction of something no one could have foreseen. Her revenge wouldn't be watching Brian suffer. Her revenge would be to live. It would be to build a family so happy, so unexpected, and so whole that the existence of the person who broke it would finally become irrelevant.